welcome to the Earth Feels podcast.
I'm Rose.
And I'm Christine.
Welcome to Earth Feels, the podcast for people feeling overwhelmed by the endlessly gloomy climate news.
Where every week we have soul-based conversations about climate change and explore the idea that climate change may be happening for us as much as it is happening to us.
If you are ready to shift your focus and secure the future for our kids and our grandkids, then this is the podcast for you.
And yes, we do know how to spell.
Good morning, Christine.
Hi, Rose. How are you?
Week 5.
Wow.
Week 5. Yeah, much better this week than last week. So, yeah. How about you?
Hanging in there. I had a real, I crashed on Monday.
Yeah.
You can ask my husband how bad it was, but it was kind of a bit of a meltdown. And, it didn't feel great, but there it is. We're all human, and this is a stressful time. So I'm just putting it out there. It turns out I'm human like the rest of us.
Well, that's good to know.
So our question today is, what are we learning about the fragility of our food supply?
Turns out quite a bit.
Yeah. That's for sure. And you're a gardener.
I am. Yep, I am. Although here in San Diego, for the time being, and I'm looking at leaving here in the next, fingers crossed that flights are still going, to go back to my garden on Cape Cod the beginning of May, and feeling really kind of antsy to have my fingers in the soil again. It's such a catharsis for many of us. And are you a gardener? Your husband is.
I am married to a gardener.
Okay.
Oh, lucky me. But
because we're all such whack jobs, our gardeners.
Well, I blame my dad because he was when I say huge gardener, I mean, we lived I grew up in a prairie farm, and our garden was huge, probably half an acre.
Oh, really?
So me and my 3 brothers were his servants.
Minions. Yeah.
Minions.
Yep.
We all hated it. And
yeah.
so gardening was not ever a really enjoyable activity for me because I grew up on garden produce. You just kind of take it for granted. But I have to say, and Mark has done his own thing, gone his own way, my husband, gardening avidly without my active support or help. But it wasn't until I read Barbara Kingsolver's book, Animal Vegetable Miracle. You're familiar with it?
Yep. Again, that's a book I read in my unconscious life. I probably could go back and read that and get a lot more out of it now.
Oh, wow. And so it's about a year that her family spends moving from Arizona. Talk about not a sustainable agriculture hotspot. There's not a lot you can grow in the garden. Solar panels, yes, are good, but
yep.
Local food. But then they moved back to Kentucky, where she was from originally, and grew their own food. Basically, tried to live as self-sufficiently as possible.
Well, collaboration. I mean, I think that's belonging to a CSA or that kind of thing over the years, where you are going and working a certain amount of hours in order to get food for your family and stuff. And it's lovely, the community aspect of things.
So, and the reason we thought it would be good to talk about this is because the current situation with the corona pandemic is bringing to the forefront, hopefully it is, bringing to the forefront how unsustainable it is not to have a local food economy. And that's something that climate activists have been saying for years. And I read, I'm trying to think, was it back in 2010 or 2012, the Transition Handbook, which is written by Rob Hopkins. I had mentioned the transition movement before, but the subtitle is From Oil Dependency to Local Resilience.
Now, I'm sorry, the author again?
Rob Hopkins. So he's
Rob
over in
Hopkins.
the UK. He's a college professor, and I think was it 2006, 2009? Around then began for, I can't remember his whole story, what twigged him into it, but concerns about climate change, and began experimenting with his college students, and then in his small village in the UK. He was in Ireland originally and then moved back to the UK, where they really took this seriously, the idea of local resiliency. What do we do? Because it's not, we've said this before, this whole system is not sustainable. This high petroleum, I mean, they say there's what, for every calorie you consume, there's 10 calories of oil, or 10 units of oil energy put into that, our current food system. So that's not sustainable. So it's so interesting for me, having been concerned about food resilience and food supplies from the climate perspective, suddenly seeing it coming up very much in this corona pandemic. And the thing is, yes, it's an issue about just physically getting out to the grocery store now, but it's long-term as well, because there very well may be a lack of workers to work in the field, to plant, to maintain, to harvest, and transport. Like this is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, well, that's coming to the forefront here in the States, because our, should I say, puny stimulus check will not, that's of $1,200 that's going to most workers, is these workers that are coming, especially here in California, where I really see it, is people were coming across the border to pick, or they come and they spend the week and then go home on the weekends back to Mexico. Those people are not being covered because they're being paid under the table, whatever, so there's so much produce that's in the fields that is rotting right now, and maybe we're not seeing the effects of that yet. But as time goes by and those workers find work elsewhere, they realize that picking is not going to be their thing anymore. They're going to move on to do something else that's going to be sustainable. Who's going to pick, and who's going to plant? And I'm sure you and I have kind of talked offline about what we're seeing, where farmers are basically just taking that food that's rotting and just putting it back into the soil and composting it back into the soil, and it's not getting into the food supply at all. And that just exacerbates. Already we know that 40% of the food that's grown never even makes it to our table. So how is this going to elevate that degree of, is it going to be 50%? Is it going to be 60%? What happens for these farmers? How is that sustainable? How can they maintain being farmers?
One of the things I read was that farmers in Florida are selling directly to the public, because
I saw that this morning. Yeah.
Restaurants and cruise ships and their whole, what they've built their business on aren't interested. But it turns out people still want food in their houses. So that's an interesting positive development. Rather than dumping it, they're saying, okay, can we get this into the hands of the people who need it? That's being creative.
But there are already places that are food deserts. So how do we get the food into those areas of the cities and stuff, that people that don't have transportation to out to where these restaurants might be? I mean, there's a lot of
grocery stores.
Well, restaurants that are, I thought you were saying restaurants that were selling directly to the public.
Farmers that
are selling directly to the public.
Selling to restaurants and cruise ships and grocery stores now aren't.
Well, I'm seeing, and I've read a couple stories about restaurants. So that's what that was the disconnect there. That restaurants they have their deliveries and stuff scheduled. They're still taking them, but they're letting the public come to them to buy their groceries, so that they don't have to stand in line at grocery stores. They can come and buy. And actually, the woman across the street in the apartment across the street, she was a restaurant worker, and her restaurant, as it was shutting down, said, we have all these greens, and we have eggs, and we have dairy and cheese and stuff. We need to get rid of it. So she took a bunch home, and then she distributed it to us neighbors in the neighborhood. So there is a new way of food getting out there.
They're developing. It's not developing.
Developing.
Yeah.
Developing. Yeah. It's this, there has to be a new way. And at this point, it's just kind of who you know and how you get your food. But what concerns me is these people that are in food deserts where there aren't grocery stores already, in the inner cities, and there probably aren't restaurants either. So how are they? And they might not have transportation to get to them. It's a whole new way of, we've got to rethink everything.
And the thing is, so there have been inner city or anti-poverty activists who've been saying that for years, that there's a food desert in poor urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing is that there are some already, before this even started, some really great stories about people changing that. So for example, Detroit, whose core has been hollowed out.
Exactly.
They have amazing stories of renewal with community gardens and urban agriculture. And so this movement is vibrant, and it will be really interesting to see how it isn't just a small group of activists anymore that will go, maybe this is important. There's a book out there I've read called Food, Not Lawns. And
I love that.
Yeah, the waste of our lawn space for or our front yard space for lawns, which nobody can eat, and it takes up chemicals and time, and the whole idea is that, what could you do with this space? I mean, Victory Gardens in England, I don't know if there was the same thing in the US, I don't remember that, but during the Second World War, because it was an island, the production of homemade or homegrown food just shot up because they had to, right?
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
we do the same thing. It's interesting because we're going into the time when we should all be doing that.
Yeah, I'm actually reading a book by the author is Tara Nolan, and it's Gardening Your Front Yard, because that's last year I started converting, and it was because 2 years ago I had an extra tomato plant that, I was just like, I'm just going to shove it in here. It didn't fit in my box that I usually have it in the backyard, and it produced so much better than the ones that in my backyard. I'm
Which
like,
is shady.
oh yes, yeah, so much more sun. So I was like, okay, I'm going to move everything. And last year I did all my tomatoes and added some zucchini and eggplant out front, and I was like, this works better. And it's still, everybody else has the manicured lawns and stuff, so I'm still a little bit of an outlier, and I've been an outlier for a long time, but I don't know why I'm still uncomfortable with it, but I am.
You're a trendsetter, not an outlier.
Okay.
And do you know what? You may well have neighbors coming to talk to you this summer.
I might. Well, last year it was interesting because I had enough extra that I was actually distributing it to other people, because you can only eat so many zucchini and so many eggplant and so many tomatoes.
Well, and I know first world problems. This is an interesting year for us because we have a very large garden in Red Lake, except this was the year that we shifted towards spending half of our year out of Red Lake and half of our year in Red Lake. And we have given over our garden. I mean, it's not like it's half an acre or anything, but it's a pretty good sized, well tilled, that's got really healthy soil. And we've given it over to some folks in Red Lake who are growing a local produce business. So they're kind of a local CSA. So we live in somewhere where there's mostly rocks and trees and lakes, not great gardening. Talk about a bit of a food desert. There's no farms within 2 hours. So this family, they are amazing at growing things in a northern climate. And so it was kind of fun to say, hey, we've got this garden space that's not going to be used. Go ahead and use it, which is great for them. But now we're like, this might be a year where we'd want a garden. And here in Victoria, Mark he's thinking long term. And so in the backyard, which it's just I don't know if it's about the same size as your backyard at Cape Cod, possibly, maybe even a little bit smaller. He's got, I can't remember how many fruit trees, but like 3 apple trees, no, I think he planted 2 more this spring, so now 5.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
he says we've owned it for the property for 4 or 5 years. We just haven't been living here. Our daughter was. So, but he's been in with this vision in mind. So he's got apple trees. They're dwarf ones, and he's going to espalier them. So he's got nectarine and apricot and peach on the southern wall, espaliered.
Wow.
The third.
And you can grow those up in Victoria.
Well, so you can if you push the season a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And he's made the acquaintance of this retired, I think he might have been an entomologist, I'm not sure, but who is passionate about getting trees, different kind of trees, fruit trees, olive trees, fig trees, kiwi trees, or vines that grow well in this. It's a Mediterranean climate.
Mm-hmm.
And so Bob Duncan is this fellow. Mark heard him speak at some CD Saturday event, which is a gardening event that communities hold, different communities hold. And so he heard Bob talking about how he goes and lectures around the world, and in exchange, when he comes home, he asks them for their hardiest plants.
Oh,
So
nice.
Mark just picked up his lemon and lime trees, little seedlings that he's going to plant, and that he's got a special covering over, so they'll get sunlight, but they'll be protected so they don't get too wet in the winter. And he built a small greenhouse in the back where he's going to put, I can't remember, maybe 4 orange trees, like mandarin and different kind of oranges, and 2 citrus trees in his.
And be able to keep them growing all year long.
Yeah.
Wow.
So in a few years, we won't have to worry about our food supply, at least fruit. But we don't have any garden boxes. We're actually lucky in that one of the girls who was renting, living here with our daughter and renting, came from a gardening family and was a big gardener. So she put in a patch of dirt and has grown there over the last 4 years. And there's still kale. They're kale trees. I'll take a picture. We can put it on. I'm serious. They're about 3 foot tall.
Wow.
And we just go out and pick the leaves, and then they regrow.
So that's perfect. Yeah.
Have to go out to get greens, although I am getting a little weary of kale salad.
Yeah, I think that's part of the so you can grow as a gardener. My lot is not big. It's 10,000 square feet or whatever. I can grow, but I'm limited to the amount of things I can grow. So I have to and then you kind of get sick of having the same thing over and over again. That's why I was thinking, the more collaborative is, can you grow something and your neighbor grows something else, and your other neighbor grows something else, and then you can switch around so that you get the variety for the nutrients, but also for your taste buds, because there's only so many cherry tomatoes. I love tomatoes, but cherry tomatoes, okay, I need.
So you know about my trick with the cherry tomatoes is picking them and dehydrating them.
I love sun-dried tomatoes. So is that similar?
Similar, only better. They're almost like candy.
Yeah.
Cut them in half. And if you have a food dehydrator, which we do, not only because we think it's important to preserve our own food, but we also go canoe camping, and so we dehydrate meals for that. And so you just cut them in half, and you put as many as you can fit on a sheet and dehydrate them. And then I always keep the bags, a bunch of baggies of them, in the freezer, because if you have one cherry tomato, well, this is true for anything dehydrated, and you put it in a jar with the other ones and it starts to mold, they all mold. Yeah. So I keep a small jar in the cupboard, but I have baggies in the freezer, and honestly, they are so delicious.
And for those of our listeners who don't have a dehydrator, because I don't, you can do the same thing at a very low temperature in your oven. You cut them out, and then you put them on like on parchment paper, and you might have to keep it on overnight, very low temperature, like 200.
If you have a convection,
yes, that works really well.
That sort of thing. I mean, and community gardens are great. Alas, because of the social distancing, I've heard some community gardens aren't going to be doing it at least the same way because of the issue. Now, I think if you don't share tools, and if you limit access or, rotate people's access to it. It might be possible, but we'll see. Every community garden will have to make its own.
Yeah, well, we're recreating everything.
Yeah. So any last words on our food supply before we talk about good news? Because
yeah, let's just go to good news. We can all use good news. Let's talk about that.
All right. Well, there was an opinion piece. Oh, excuse me. You're going to have to say it. I've got something I wrote.
Okay. There was an opinion piece just recently about a Green New Deal going on in Europe, and you have to jump in here.
Okay.
I don't remember how many countries were involved.
Right. So right now it's not at the stage where there's any legislation, from what I understand, but there was a very strong opinion piece published in an online forum where 10 EU environment ministers signed it. And here's a quote from it: "The Green New Deal must be central to a resilient recovery after COVID-19. So they're publicly saying this is important. And after that was published, Germany and France, who hadn't signed on to it originally, both added their names. And I believe Greece was also expected to do that as well. So it's while it's nothing tangible, it's not legislation yet, it is signaling the direction that the EU is going to go, which is very exciting because I don't know if we should talk a bit about a Green New Deal, but basically the idea is that when you marry concern about the environment and climate change with the direction you move your economy, then not only does it address the concerns of climate change, it employs a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good news. It is a good news story. It's a win-win. You get jobs, you get economic recovery, and you have cleaner water, cleaner air, and a more stable climate. I mean, the only people that are going to be disappointed by that move, of course, are oil and gas companies.
Which they're kind of disappointed right now anyway. So that can't come a moment too soon. So yeah, it would be nice to see if what happens in Europe spreads. Spreads throughout Asia and spreads throughout. Well, everything's changing right now. So we're going to need to recreate the job communities and the food supplies.
I mean, we have no idea. We've never done this, our generation. So it happened after the Second World War, right?
Mm-hmm. Tell me what happened after the Second World War. I want to make sure
that they had to rebuild the economy.
Right.
So just talking about oil and gas, I thought I sneak this in there as a slice of good news for those of us who are concerned about climate change. So there's an article from desmogblog.com on the 13th of April, which was Monday. Big banks pull financing, prepare to seize assets from collapsing oil and gas industry.
So I'm a little confused on that, because I think some of the banks are actually looking that they're going to pull the assets, and they're going to have to create their own companies to manage those assets. So the banks are going to own some of the fracking companies?
Well, they'll take over. So they seize the assets when they can't meet their obligations. The companies can't meet their financial obligations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, seizing assets and holding them until oil prices increase would likely minimize the losses, because the other way it would be for the companies to declare bankruptcy and the banks would lose even more. I'm going to just read a quote. While banks seizing assets from borrowers who can't repay loans is common for industries like real estate, especially residential real estate, it is an unusual move for the oil and gas industries. Reuters reported that the last time it happened was during the oil price crash of the late 1980s. In the most recent oil price crash, when oil dropped from prices over $100 to a barrel to $40 a barrel, there was a rash of bankruptcies, but the banks didn't seize assets. So it says that this is late 80s bad. Like, it's bad because shale oil companies have continued to increase their debt thanks to loans from these banks. So they're not at all viable now. And so, I mean, do you feel sorry for big banks? I'm sorry, not really.
No, I don't feel sorry
You
for
feel
big
sorry
mans.
for
Oil companies? No, don't
No,
feel sorry
not
for oil
really.
companies.
What do you
But they're workers, but they're workers, the tellers, the people that are working the oil fields and those kind of things. Those people, their jobs are going to go away.
which is
And
why
those
a Green New Deal is so important.
Yeah, exactly.
And nobody's gonna. So banks are still going to be viable. They're just not going to be as rich. Right?
Oh well.
Exactly.
Oh well.
Exactly. So
action step. We're going back to talking about farming or gardening because we can just go down this rabbit hole forever, Christine and I. So action step. Look at what you can plant in your yard. You don't need a big plot. You can do stuff on your patio. You just have to look for seeds that say dwarf or patio size. What can you grow in your yard that you could trade with your neighbor? Cause you to have a conversation with them over the garden fence, right?
Yeah. So is that something that you've done, Rose?
It is. So I have a neighbor who doesn't live on Cape year round, but comes down in the summertime, and he's an avid fisherman, and he'll go out and bring us lovely fish that I've never heard of before. Not something that's in the markets, and he'll give us his excess, and in return we give him tomatoes and eggplant and zucchini. It's a win-win for both of us. His wife is like, I don't want to have all of this fish. And James is looking at me and goes, I can't eat one more tomato. So, we're helping our significant others as well.
Yes. That's nice. And like you say, we'll put some links up. You don't have to build a huge plot in your front yard, like Rose said, but just think maybe even just herbs if you haven't done it before. It's great to have.
Start small.
Yeah. Or expand if you already have a garden. This is the year to do it. If you're thinking about gardening, you want to garden and you haven't, this would be the year to do it because our food system is going to be challenged as it hasn't been before in the span of Rose and my lifetimes anyways. If you lived through the Second World War, then maybe, but interesting times ahead for our food supply.
Well, and this kind of resilience, I think it's good for everybody. It's life-sustaining skills. It's life skills.
Yeah. And it feels good too to garden, which reminds me, I was supposed to go and help do some gardening in our backyard today, so I better go and do that.
Okay. All right. Well, great talking to you again.
That's this week's episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.